All right, hi everyone. This is chapter 42, which is going to deal with gas exchange and circulation. So here we're going to be looking at two systems in the body, two interconnected systems, the respiratory system and the circulatory system, and how they are functioning in vertebrates, a little bit in invertebrates as well. Your discussion question this week will actually deal with connecting this to the digestive system, which we talked about in the last lecture. So you're going to want to think about how taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide is actually related to food as well. So as we go through this, I'll try to discuss a little bit some of those connections as well to help you out with that DQ. So the purpose of these systems is to continuously exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide between, the environment and an organism. So the oxygen comes from the atmosphere, taking in the oxygen, and the carbon dioxide is coming as a waste product of cellular respiration. So inside of an organism, we need to effectively transport and move the CO2 through the blood and out of the lungs and ultimately, to leave the body as waste. And the same thing needs to happen with oxygen. So the oxygen needs to go from the outside into the lungs, from the lungs into the bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream ultimately making its way to the cells so that they can do cellular respiration at their mitochondria and make ATP. So those gases, oxygen and CO2, are going to be mainly what we focus on, but waste, nutrients, and other types of molecules are also going to move through the body and move through the respiratory and circulatory systems. So here's some of the different structures of the respiratory system. So, really including the mouth in this as well is generally something that you'd see. But air comes in and air goes down through the trachea or the windpipe. And from there, the windpipe is going to continuously bifurcate. And by bifurcate, I mean it's going to split into tiny tubes and tinier tubes. So those tiny tubes are called the bronchi, and all throughout the lungs you've got these separating bronchi, and ultimately they're going to end with these very tiny bronchioles. So the bronchioles are going to be, those terminal bronchioles are going to be really tiny, and they're going to end with these sac structures called alveoli. And these alveoli are going to be the site of gas exchange. You can see here in this picture that the alveoli is covered in a dense network of capillaries, and capillaries are going to be responsible for the exchange of oxygen, CO2 through their capillary walls. So collectively, that branching of bronchi into bronchioles to alveoli make up the lungs. And the lungs are surrounded by these cavities and spaces called pleura. So we've got the visceral pleura, which is a space right alongside of the lung. And then you've got a space in the middle called the pleural space. And then you've got on the outside the parietal pleura, which you can see is right up along the muscles and the ribs here in this case. And then the lungs can expand and contract thanks to that visceral space and the sliding kind of friction that takes place between that space and the two pleuras. So there's 5 major steps here that are involved in gas exchange. And these take together and show the interconnectedness of the respiratory and circulatory systems. So the first step is ventilation. So that's the movement of air basically through the lungs or the gills. So ventilation is breathing. So there's pulmonary ventilation, we think about the lungs. There's other types of ventilation as well. But this can occur, in humans through the lungs and animals through the lungs, but also in terrestrial animals, I should say, but in fish, this is going to occur with water passing through the gills, but the same structure involved there and taking in, or same function, I should say, different structure. Diffusion takes place once the oxygen moves from the air and the water into the gas exchange organs, such as the lungs or the gill. It's then got to go into the blood, or from the blood to the air or the water. So that's the diffusion that takes place through the capillaries. Circulation is oxygen and CO2 moving throughout the body via the circulatory system, and diffusion is going to take place. I guess this should be separated into the 6. I think diffusion is a separate thing here, but circulation and diffusion are separated usually. But diffusion is going to happen where oxygen moves from the blood to the tissues, CO2 moves from the tissues to the blood, and that's going to happen down the concentration gradient. It's diffusion, no energy required. And cellular respiration is what takes place at the cellular level here, and that's where the cell is going to take oxygen and use it to make ATP, and it's going to, as a waste product, produce CO2. So cellular respiration is ultimately going to pull out oxygen levels from the tissues and push CO2 into the tissues, and that produces a gradient that allows for diffusion to take place from the blood to the tissues or from the tissues to the blood. So it all works passively, and it's pretty amazing how it does, in fact, work. So here's a nice figure to show you everything that we just kind of talked about. So here's ventilation, and the oxygen, the CO2, and the air or the water are going to move through the respiratory system. So we'll follow oxygen since we're going in that direction. So oxygen comes from the air or the water, and through some kind of structure, the lung, the gill, the oxygen makes its way into circulation. It diffuses from the blood into the tissues here, and ultimately makes its way to the mitochondria to do cellular respiration. Cellular respiration occurs, ATP is produced, and CO2 is a waste product. So now we've got to get rid of that CO2. So now CO2 is going to diffuse into the blood, from the blood through the respiratory system, and then back out into the environment. So this happens continuously, a very simplified diagram there of what's happening. So diffusion and ventilation, when we're talking about this happening at the respiratory surface, so specifically at the alveoli of the lungs, if we're looking at the lungs, this all takes place in the respiratory system, whereas the circulatory system is going to be responsible for taking the oxygen, CO2, and other materials and moving them around the body. So the circulatory system is your blood and your, I guess, you're thinking about veins and arteries here. Veins are going to be taking blood towards the heart, and then arteries are going to be taking blood away from the heart, and they all make up the circulatory system, sometimes called the cardiovascular system as well. But in some animals, there isn't a heart, so it's really not appropriate to say cardiovascular, so we say circulatory because you're circulating things throughout the body. So how do vertebrate lungs work? So in terrestrial animals like you and I, air is going to come into the body through the mouth and the nose, and then from there the air is going to move down the trachea to the bronchi. And I've mentioned this with the figure, but the bronchi is then going to continuously bifurcate into these tiny branches that are narrower and smaller, and they're going to end with the very small microscopic bronchioles that will end with the alveoli. The specific organ of ventilation is the lung. So the lung is, where all of these things are housed. It encloses the bronchioles. And like I said, the very end of the bronchi branch into the alveoli, which are those little things that look like grapes. And they are where gas exchange occurs. So lots of surface area in those alveoli. So anytime you have gas exchange or any exchange of nutrients or diffusion, surface area is key. So humans have approximately 150 million alveoli per lung with high surface areas. Animals with lungs, some fishes, lungfishes they're called, do actually have lungs, believe it or not. Amphibians have lungs, but they're not as developed as reptiles, birds, and other mammals' lungs. So lung structure and ventilation do vary among species, but there's some commonalities among all of them. The alveoli provide the interface between the air and the blood that consists of a thin aqueous film. So the alveoli have something called surfactant in them, that's that thin aqueous film, and it allows them to not kind of fold and stick to themselves. Okay, so you can imagine a balloon that's wet, it's going to stick to itself inside, right? Whereas if you have sort of a slippery surface on there, it won't stick to itself, and that's what the surfactant does. It's also a layer of epithelial cells, and they allow for the exchange of gases, that thin layer of epithelial cells. Some extracellular matrix material, and of course the wall of the capillary, and all of these things allow for that exchange to take place between these capillaries which surround the alveoli. So the capillaries are going to take the oxygen and draw it away from the alveoli, and they're going to take the CO2 and put it in there to ultimately send it out from the body or out from the outside into the tissues. So how does this all work in terms of the human lung? So the pressure inside the chest cavity is a little bit less than 5 millimeters of mercury than the atmospheric pressure. And that has to do with the fact that gases are going to move down their pressure gradient. So as long as the pressure in your chest is less than the pressure in the environment, air is going to flow in. okay? If we get into a situation where the pressure changes, let's say you're in an airplane and the airplane loses altitude or something like that, then you can't take in air anymore, and that's bad news, right? So we always want to have the pressure in your lungs lower than the pressure in the environment. And the closer they get to each other, the more of a problem we have. So that's why as you get to elevated pressures in the if you're climbing a mountain and something like that, or you're going deep below the ocean, it becomes very difficult to breathe. You can actually change the pressure in your cavity, and now that I'm thinking about breathing, I'm breathing heavier, but you can change that by contracting and relaxing your diaphragm. So during inhalation, the diaphragm moves down, therefore the pressure is lowered, the lungs expand and air moves in. During exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes, chest cavity decreases, and therefore air is exhaled. So just remember here, air is going to move down its pressure gradient. Where you have a high pressure to a low pressure is where air is going to move, and that will affect inhalation and exhalation of the lungs. Okay, so here's a great figure again showing you the lungs expanding and contracting in response to changes in the pressure cavity. So here in inhalation, you can see the diaphragm is moving down. You're getting the more negative diaphragm, and pressure is decreasing. Here you're seeing the pressure in the lungs increasing, forcing exhalation out. Okay, and the same thing is showing you there with the balloon in the jar. So it's modeling the same thing as your lungs. This is a good lab to do. When I taught this course, the online version of Anatomy and Physiology too, there's a video lab that has you do this in a plastic bottle, which is pretty cool. Okay, so how does this work in terms of your homeostatic control, right? So keeping your body at a constant rate. So you may have seen somebody breathing into a bag or hyperventilating, right? That's kind of what this has to do with. So increasing breathing rate is going to increase the rate of oxygen delivery to muscles and tissues. So if they're starved for oxygen, you're going to increase your breathing rate. It's going to increase the elimination of carbon dioxide as well, and maintain relatively constant partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide, even during intense exercise. So if you think about it, you're exercising intensely, you're needing more oxygen for your muscles, and you're needing to expend more CO2 because your muscle cells are doing more cellular respiration. So a little bit about kind of the basics of how this is happening in terms of your nervous system and the receptors here to that between your peripheral nervous system, your somatic here, and your sympathetic and parasympathetic. So CO2 is going to diffuse into your cerebral spinal fluid, which is causing the formation of something called carbonic acid, and that's going to essentially drop the pH, making it more acidic. Okay, so when that happens, we get the breakdown to bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Okay, that's going to excite chemoreceptors in the central nervous system, which is going to stimulate breathing. Okay, so kind of interesting there to see that distinction and how it works with pH and how pH actually affects that. So the more acidic your blood is, the more you're going to breathe because of that CO2 diffusing into the cerebral spinal fluid. So really amazing. And that's going to get those receptors going. Okay, so that's the basics of the respiratory system, very basic. So how about once oxygen and CO2 are in the blood? So what is blood? Blood's a connective tissue. It's going to consist of formed elements. It's going to consist of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. It's got a watery extracellular matrix called plasma. Okay, it's liquid, obviously. Major functions of blood: transporting oxygen and CO2, like we said, transporting nutrients to cells from the digestive system. So there it is. There's that discussion question. Just elaborate on that. Move waste products to the kidney and the liver, convey hormones. Hormones are going to move from from the hypothalamus, maybe all the way down to your toes. Deliver immune system cells to the site of infection and distribute heat throughout the body. The extracellular matrix of plasma, so if you took a sample of blood and you spun it really, really fast, you would see that it would separate out into these various components. So the plasma contains platelets that are cell fragments that are used to kind of patch up if there's an injury. Those platelets will rush to that injury and form a clot or a patch over it. White blood cells are going to fight infections. So your white blood cells are your immune cells. Red blood cells are the big guys used in transporting oxygen and CO2. And 99.9% of the formed elements in blood are, in fact, red blood cells. So how do red blood cells carry oxygen and CO2? Well, it has to attach to a protein called hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is made up of a protein called heme, and it's globular by the shape. And heme contains an iron ion that can bind to an oxygen molecule. So that's why we see iron becoming very important in blood. So if someone is iron deficient, they can become anemic, and their blood does not carry oxygen appropriately. So based on the structure of hemoglobin, it can bind to 4 oxygen molecules. And in blood, 98.5% of the oxygen is actually bound to hemoglobin. The other 1.5% is dissolved in plasma. And depending on the needs of the body, that hemoglobin can be really sticky to oxygen, or it can be really loose from the oxygen. So something like blood pH, like we talked about, right, is going to affect how sticky the oxygen actually is in hemoglobin. Because if your tissues need it, it doesn't want to be stuck to hemoglobin in the blood. The oxygen wants to make its way to the tissues, right? So here's a look at this figure. And you can see that each hemoglobin molecule can bind to up to 4 molecules of oxygen right here. So there's your hemoglobin. And in the bottom picture, it's showing you that oxygen is loading from the lungs to the hemoglobin, and it's unloading to the tissue. And that depends on the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissue. And if there's remember, these gases are going to move down their pressure gradient, so they're going to go from where there's a high pressure to a low pressure, and all depends on the needs of the body. So animals maximize the surface area available for the gases of diffusion and other solutes in different ways. So if we've got a really small animal, then just diffusion over the body is fine. So if we're talking about a flatworm or even a tapeworm, right, they can just do diffusion of substances through their body, and it's no problem. They don't need to have all of these organs and specialized structures. Diffusion in roundworms is accomplished by muscular contractions of the body wall, and the highly folded gastrovascular cavity of jellyfish offers enough surface area for exchange. So it depends on the needs of the animal, how big the animal is, how they move materials around. So in humans, we've got different blood vessels that do the job. So arteries, capillaries, and veins. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. They're thick. They have muscular walls. They pump. The aorta is a huge artery that pumps blood away from the heart to the whole body. It's muscular, and it's very important. Look at the size of the muscular layer here of the arteries. Compare that to the veins. I'll jump down the veins for a second, which have much smaller muscular layers, and they also have valves within them that allow blood to move through them. Arteries will ultimately branch down into very small arterioles, and then even smaller are capillaries, which are where gas exchange occurs, and capillaries are so small just one red blood cell passes through them at a time. Veins, like I mentioned, are carrying blood back to the heart, and they're very thin-walled, and the smallest veins are called venules. The structure of these vessels correlates with their function, okay, just like everything else that we see in anatomy and physiology. All right, so this is kind of an interesting figure. You can take a look at this. Some cool facts here about arteries, veins, capillaries. If all the blood vessels in your body laid end to end, not only would you be dead, but they'd also be 60,000 miles, which is pretty incredible. All right, so last thing here, I believe, we're going to be talking about the heart. So after blood circulates through the capillary beds, the lungs, alveoli, and becomes oxygenated, the heart is going to pump it through the body. So oxygenated blood is going to enter the left atrium. When the left atrium contracts, it pushes the blood into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it goes up into the aorta and then throughout the body. So in through the pulmonary veins, to the left atrium, through the mitral valve, left ventricle, aortic valve, out to the aorta, which will then branch and then go off to all of the arteries of the body. Okay, so it goes out to all the arteries of the body. You can imagine now it's getting soaked up all that oxygen is leaving, it's picking up CO2. We need to return it to the lungs to get this blood reoxygenated and get that CO2 out. So the blood from the bottom part of the body is going to come in through the inferior vena cava. From the head, it's going to drain to the superior vena cava, go to the right atrium, to the tricuspid valve, right ventricle, pulmonary valve here, out the pulmonary artery to go to the lungs. So sometimes people think, oh, arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood. And you can see here that there is an exception to that. Right? The pulmonary artery is carrying deoxygenated blood, but it is carrying it away from the heart. Okay, the pulmonary vein is carrying oxygenated blood to the heart. So always remember, veins carry blood to the heart, arteries, A for artery, A for away from the heart. Okay, and that's what this is showing you here. Okay, pulmonary circulation on the left is what's happening on the right side of the heart, okay, where blood enters the right atrium, returning from the body, right ventricle. This all comes from the vena cava up to the pulmonary artery. Systemic circulation is taking this blood that's been reoxygenated, returning it to the heart so the heart can pump it to the bodies. So pulmonary veins take blood in, bring it into the left atrium, through the mitral valve, through the left ventricle, out the aorta to the body. Okay, so the left side of the heart is significantly more muscular than the right side of the heart because it's got to pump blood all throughout the body, whereas the right side is just pumping it right to the lungs, and the lungs are right next to the heart, so there's not a whole lot of muscle needed to pump the right side. Okay, and that's what this is showing you as well in this figure. So how does this all work? So the heart is amazing because it's got its own electrical system, and something called the SA node is a sort of bundle of electrical tissue located in the right atrium, and it generates an electrical signal, and it is the pacemaker of the heart, and it essentially sets the rhythm of the heartbeat. So that signal from the SA node is sent through the right atrium all throughout it, signaling it to contract, okay, and inject blood into the ventricles, and then that signal is propagated through the right atrium and through all of the, through the right ventricle and left ventricle, through these other nodes. The signal goes from the SA node to the AV node, down to the AV bundle, or the bundle of His, which separates into these bundle branches, which come down. This is all just electrical signals being transmitted through these, and then ends with the Purkinje fibers. And once it reaches the Purkinje fibers, the ventricles contract. So this is all about how the transmission of electrical impulses takes place from the SA node to the AV node to the AV bundle, or the bundle of His, the bundle branches, and the Purkinje fibers, and then those, you can't see my hands, but my hands are showing the ventricles getting squeezed and pushing blood up into the aorta and the pulmonary arteries. Okay. So all of this in terms of blood moving is controlled by your blood pressure. Okay, so the overall coordination of blood flow and pressure is under the control of your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response. So cardiac output, which is the amount of blood that is pumped out of the heart per minute, increases due to an increase in both your heart rate and the amount of blood pushed out by the ventricles. Makes sense, right? The arterioles, remember those tiny arteries, serving the capillaries of non-critical tissues are constricted to divert blood to more critical organs. So in a sympathetic nervous system response, what's happening is you're running away from a bear, you're terrified from something, you're fighting something, so you need all the blood to go away from non-vital places, away from, let's say, digestion, which is something that can wait, to running away because your life is in danger. Also in this, your veins are constricted, blood is shifted towards the heart, and blood pressure is maintained to the vital organs. And then when you get back to normal, your parasympathetic nervous system is going to kick in, and then you can, evenly distribute the blood throughout the body. But at this point, the blood is all going towards getting you away from running from the bear or whatever situation you're in. Okay? So that's what this figure is essentially showing you. So when you're at homeostasis, your blood pressure is in a normal range, and then an imbalance occurs, right? So in this case, we've tipped the scale and the blood pressure has gone down. So impulses in your baroreceptors are going to stimulate the cardiovascular center in the brain to inhibit the cardioinhibitory center, stimulate the brain to increase heart rate. So what do? We constrict the arteries, we increase cardiac output, and then blood pressure is increased. There's lots of other things involved in this as well. There's lots of hormones. There's ACE. There's the renin-angiotensin system, the kidneys and the adrenal glands, right? But we're not going to really get into all of that. Let's say your blood pressure gets too high. The opposite is going to happen. The baroreceptors are going to cause the arteries to dilate. And when they dilate, it lowers your blood pressure. Okay? So that ends this chapter. Hope you found it interesting. And make sure you complete your mastering assignments for this week.